Welcome to the first Legends and Lore class, where I present video game lore and history as if it's real-life history in a real-life history class. Today's lesson is going to be on Mithrax from Destiny 2. Mithrax is a really interesting character in Elixni culture within Destiny. A lot of people theorize that he's going to be the Kell of Kells, which within the Elixni culture is a person of some amount of myth or heroism, who is said to unite all Elixni into one great house that will lead them into the future. At the moment, Mithrax is the Kell of Light. Yes, Gavin.
Are there other mythological entities in the Kell's history?
We'll get to that as we move on. Today's lesson is going to be on Mithrax specifically. There will be a later lesson on Elixni culture as a more general presentation.
Awesome.
Mithrax's story begins in the Long Drift, which is a period in Elixni history directly after what they call the Whirlwind, which was an apocalyptic event where they were forced to evacuate their entire planet. Mithrax, which is pronounced Mithrax in the Elixni tongue, was born into the House of Wolves. He was the son of the Kell of the House of Wolves. The Kell was named Enox. Rakis, currently known as the Spider, and Civix became reluctant friends of his after they met, under some amount of order from Mithrax's mother. Rakis and Civix were traded from the House of Dancers, which was ruled by Aramis, who's the current Kell of Darkness. Traded is not really the correct word from that. They were more just kind of dumped onto the House of Wolves. They were a burden that Aramis didn't want to deal with. Under Enox's orders, they would protect Mithrax from the more grown-up Elixni, who would bully him, try to steal his ether reserves, things of that sort. And eventually, like all other Elixni, Mithrax would eventually find his way into Sol. After arriving in Sol, the House of Wolves would eventually come upon the Dark Pyramid on Luna, or as we know it, our moon, and there they would find the corpse of Nezarec. Enox would take pieces of Nezarec's corpse and distribute them among her crew. Eventually, after some time and after he grew up, Mithrax would inherit a piece of the corpse of his own and go on to lead his own crew, with Rakis and Civix serving under him. His reign as a captain was bloody and brutal. And after some time, he eventually stranded Rakis and Civix on an asteroid, believing them to be working against him. Mithrax would eventually go on to lose the piece of Nezarec's corpse, and his violent reign ended, though it is not detailed exactly how he lost this corpse. Eventually, this would result in him returning to the traditional Elixni house structure. After some time, Mithrax would go on to join the Awoken. During a battle between the House of Wolves and Queen Mara Sov's Corsairs, he was captured by Sieur Ido, the, at the time, Queen's Wrath. Mithrax believed he was going to be tortured for information, but refused to betray his house, and so attempted to throw himself off of a nearby cliff. Sieur Ido caught him by the ankle and hauled him back up, then binding his legs on top of his already bound arms. Much to Mithrax's surprise, however, Sieur Ido would then go on to perform a Irelis bow, a display of peace among the Elixni. She would then place a knife between them and introduce herself, which, according to Elixni culture, Mithrax would be honor-bound to return. Over time, Mithrax would grow more familiar with the Awoken and Sieur Ido specifically, and aid them in their fight against the forces of darkness and still hostile Elixni houses. After a battle against the House of Wolves and Devils, Mithrax was aiding the Corsairs and the Queen's Crows with the battlefield cleanup when he came across a crashed skiff and heard a noise coming from a ventilation shaft. Inside was a fresh Elixni hatchling. Mithrax would adopt her and name her Ido, and she would lead Mithrax to a new chapter in his life. Many years later, Mithrax would leave the Awoken after the death of Sieur Ido during the Reef Wars, in the chaos after the Taken War. He would then go on to join the House of Dusk. Mithrax's first major interaction with the Guardians and the Vanguard as a whole would come on Titan, on which he intended to claim a methane reactor, which he wanted to use to power servitors he would use to feed his crew. During the process of this, he would come into contact with a specific Guardian, and after several narrow misses involving energy shields and some Hive, he would eventually come into combat with a Hive Knight named Gulthor the Subtle. A Guardian would come upon them in combat and decide to aid Mithrax, killing the Hive Knight, after which Mithrax would bow and allow the Guardian to claim the reactor for the Vanguard. Sometime after this, Mithrax would then return to the Tangled Shore and leave the House of Dusk. Sometime after this, while he was spending his time on the Tangled Shore, he would come upon a warlock and a hunter, whom he would befriend and travel with. On one of his journeys, Mithrax would tell them that his name was originally pronounced Mithrax, and like many of the current houses who adopted new names upon coming to Sol, he adopted a human pronunciation for it. Later on, he would eventually go on to tell his new fire team that he had a plan to establish a new house for the Elixni, who would aid humanity in protecting the Traveler. This would become the House of Light. His fire team vowed to help them in whatever way they could. The next major chapter of Mithrax's life and his interactions with the Guardians would come during the 0 Hour mission. He would signal a Guardian to come to the farm in the EDZ and meet with them. There he would inform them of a heist planned by Aramis the Ship Stealer and current Kell of Darkness. They would go to the old tower and fight the House of Devils, which had intended to steal a Siva weapon from the Cryptarch vaults that were still left there. With a bit of help from the Guardians, they prevented the heist and defeated Syrinx, who served Aramis. This would be only the first of Mithrax's major cooperations with the Vanguard. During the period when Guardians were first learning to wield the darkness and traveling to Europa, Varix was sending defectors of House Salvation to Mithrax and House Light. Anyone who was searching for peace and trying to escape Europa in the war that Aramis was waging against humanity would be allowed to join House Light. Mithrax would take in these refugees, give them a home, make sure they were fed, safe, and taken care of. And unlike many other houses, Mithrax would distribute the ether stores evenly, leading to all the Elixni being fairly equally grown. You see a lot less Archons and Captains within House Light because of this. They had never grown to as large. While he did not make any direct moves against her at the time, Mithrax would stand firmly in opposition against Aramis in her adoption of the darkness and stasis abilities. Mithrax's next major move would come during what came to be called the Endless Night, a period where the last city was trapped in a simulation of eternal night by the Vex. During the Endless Night, the Vanguard would make contact with Mithrax while he was on Europa to request assistance in dealing with the simulation. Mithrax found himself to be more concerned with the fate of his own people, however, and so Ikora Rey, a member of the Vanguard, offered him and his house safety within the walls of the city. Mithrax accepted the offer, and despite the persecution the Elixni would face from such people as members of the Future War Cult, New Monarchy, or the Dead Orbit, they found a home there, and were instrumental in defeating Coria, the Blade Mine, and ending the Vex simulation that trapped the city. House of Light would continue to have a home within the city, and begin to construct homes and farms for themselves within the old Batza district. Sometime after Aramis's defeat at the hands of the Guardians, she would be freed from her prison in ice on Europa, and bring back the Old Crews, groups of Elixni that retained their old, violent, plundering ways from their days during the Long Drift. The Old Crews still held on to some pieces of Nezarex's corpse, and would use them to fight off and plunder and pillage different parts of the system. Mithrax and his daughter Ida, who is now a scribe for House Light, played a very important role in the defeat of the Old Crews and the reclamation of Nezarex's corpse. During this time, Ido would be saved from several hive by Aramis herself. Upon meeting her, however, Mithrax would face Aramis in a duel and defeat her. But, to Ido's objection, under Ido's advice, I should say, Mithrax would spare Aramis and allow her to leave. The final major cooperation in recent history that Mithrax would have with the vanguard of humanity would come during the Avalon mission. Mithrax would use the piece... Before this, though, Mithrax would use the pieces of Nezarec recovered from the old crews to create a tincture that would be used to awaken Osiris, the warlock, from his coma that he was left in after his possession by Savathun, the Witch Queen. His final major operation would be the Avalon mission, which was an incursion into the Vex network. There, it would be discovered that Asher Mir, former Vanguard operative on the planet of Io, who was thought to have died when Io disappeared, was alive and had integrated himself into the Vex network. During this operation, Asher Mir would gift the Guardian with a glaive known as Vexcalibur. Now, up to recent history, these are all of Mithrax's major operations with the Vanguard and humanity as a whole. And as of now, this is Mithrax's complete history. Do we have any questions?
I don't have any.
Then class is dismissed.